Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Ron's Amazing Stories. We have stories that should thrill you a little and chill you a little.
It's amazing.
What you'll hear are adventures sent in by you guys, classic stories from the pulp mags, and episodes from the golden age of radio. We have special segments like Ghost Stories with Sylvia.
That's amazing.
And These Are Your Stories. So settle in for the next hour and enjoy the show. One more thing. You just might want to prepare yourself to be taken away from today.
Another 5-minute mystery.
This 5-minute mystery is being brought to you by the word confusion.
I am so confused right now.
As you should be. Johnny Depp once said, "I pretty much try to stay in a constant state of confusion just because of the expression it leaves on my face."
That is wonderful.
Lieutenant Evans, Homicide Bureau.
Lieutenant, this is Dr. Norton at the city hospital.
Oh, yes, Doctor. What can I do for you?
I'm afraid I have some business for you, Lieutenant. I have a cough down here that may be of interest to you.
I'm only interested in a certain type, Doctor. Unless this is a case
This is directly in your line, Lieutenant Evans. It's murder.
Where's your late patient, Doctor?
In here, Lieutenant Evans.
The identification on the fellow?
No, his pockets were empty. Well, here's your man, or what's left of him.
Pretty well carved up, isn't he?
Yes. Death was caused by a knife into the heart. All the other wounds were merely an anticlimax. Speaking medically, of course.
Which one of your ambulance men picked him up?
Oh, I'm sorry. I should have told you before this. But he was brought in here by a motorist who picked him up at the side of the road.
Did you get the fellow's name and address?
I did better than that, Lieutenant. I asked him to wait until you got here.
Good. I'll see him right away. Where is he?
In my office. Down this way.
I have a hunch he'll prove interesting. A man who'll give a ride to a corpse. Tell me, Mr. Scott, what time was it when you picked up the body?
I should say it was about 11 o'clock in the evening, Lieutenant. I drove directly to the hospital after that.
That was a pretty isolated road you picked to go riding on, Mr. Scott.
It's an old habit of mine to avoid the holiday weekend traffic, Lieutenant. I always use the back roads.
Was the body still bleeding when you found it?
I suppose so, Doctor. He was dead, but I put him in the back seat and rushed here as quickly as I could.
How long was that ride, Mr. Scott?
About a half hour, Lieutenant.
I estimated the death to have occurred about 9 o'clock this evening.
That was an hour before Mr. Scott discovered the body. Well, that's about all the information I'll need right now, Mr. Scott. You'll be asked to come to the coroner's inquest, of course.
I don't mind that, Lieutenant, but my time is rather valuable. I hope to be compensated for it.
I'm sorry, but I don't handle that angle for the city.
Is there any sort of claim I filed to get the back seat in my car fixed?
What happened to it?
The covers are all blood-soaked.
I told you I don't take care of that sort of stuff.
I thought murderers were your business, Lieutenant.
They are, but you don't mean...
I do, Lieutenant. If you pardon the doctor's intrusion, I'll have to diagnose Mr. Scott as suffering from a malignant case of murder.
What clue did Dr. Morton discover that led to his analysis of the crime? In just a moment we'll know, but first...
What clue indeed. Okay, BG, I am confused.
I have to admit that, I too, am a bit befuddled. The stab wounds alone are a good indicator that a murder took place, and all the doctor said was that this was a malignant case of murder.
I agree. Do you think our roadside benefactor is the killer?
Well, it has to be, but no one was charged with a crime. So, I'm not sure.
Well, for once we agree.
Don't let this go to your head.
I wouldn't think of it.
And now, back to our story.
That's a bad guess, Dr. Norton.
Only on your part, Scott. In thinking you could get away with it. You tipped your hand when you tried to get compensation for being courteous enough to take your victim to a hospital. I stated that he'd been dead for 1.5 hours when you brought him here. You claimed to have found the body an hour after its death. Assuming that to be true, the back seat of your car never would have been soaked with blood. The only circumstances that could have made that possible were for you to have killed him in that back seat, where he bled to death.
Backseat drivers and backseat killers. They're all alike. They just talked themselves to death.
Well, does that mean the guy in the back seat talked himself to death?
Wrong. I think that the doctor is saying that the roadside benefactor talked himself right into a murder charge.
Oh, I get it. That means he said too much. Like you, most of the time.
Wrong. You remind me of a steel trap.
Because I'm so smart?
No, because nothing can get out.
Nice.
What's that you say?
Hello, and welcome to the podcast. Today, we are going to break a record.
Ron, what record?
I'm glad you asked. We have more individual segments in a single episode than ever before. We have What's That You Say? Audible. These Are Your Stories, which include 3 tales from you guys.
Is that a lot?
It is. Our featured stories segment has 3 science fiction short stories.
3. That is amazing.
I know. Then we have a brand new Johnny Is It True Science Fiction Fact Edition, some amazing OTR commercials, and we end the show by traveling to August 25th, 1944, a moment in time.
A tour de force.
Well, thank you. Well, you haven't heard the show yet, so please hold your applause until the end. I received this email question from Randall Mysterious, and like his namesake, he didn't say where he was from. Randall writes, Hey Ron, I have a concern about the old-time radio programs you play on the show. I'm pretty sure they must be copyrighted or trademarked. Have you ever looked into this? Also, the Pulp magazine stories would have the same issue. Well, Randall, first, thank you for the question. I have looked into this, and in 1968, the copyright system for the United States changed. It was the responsibility of the content creators to reestablish their rights. Most of the radio folks and magazines didn't take the time to do this. I only play the shows and articles that chose not to retain their rights. That is why you will never hear a CBS Radio Mystery Theater on the show. It was made after 1968. Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/Ron's Amazing Stories. Audible has sponsored the show now since July of 2019. We have reviewed more than 140 audiobooks, and the list keeps growing. Did you know that Audible has over 200,000 books available? And a lot of those are included in the free catalog. Audible is amazing, and it is the perfect companion to Ron's Amazing Stories. If you like this podcast, you're going to love Audible. So what am I listening to? Dragon Teeth, a novel by Michael Crichton, narrated by Scott Brick and his wife, Sherry Crichton. Well, I'm sure you know that name. Michael Crichton was the creator and author of Jurassic Park. He's also done countless other classic stories that have gone on to cinema greatness, like Andromeda Strain or Westworld. Based on the name of this one, I'm guessing you think that this is going to be another dinosaur tale? And you would be right, sort of. Crichton returns to the world of paleontology in a thrilling adventure set in the Wild West during the golden age of fossil hunting. The year is 1876. Warring tribes still populate America's western territories, even as lawless gold rush towns begin to mark the landscape. Against this backdrop, two obsessive scientists pillaged the Wild West, hunting for dinosaur fossils and continually sabotaging each other in a rivalry that will become known as the Bone Wars. Into this treacherous war plunges the arrogant and entitled William Johnson, a Yale student with more privilege than sense. Determined to survive a summer in the West, William has joined world-renowned paleontologist Orthaniel Charles Marsh on his latest expedition. But when the paranoid and secretive Marsh becomes convinced that William is spying on him, he abandons him in Cheyenne, Wyoming. William is forced to join forces with a scoundrel professor and soon stumbles upon a discovery of historic proportions. And with this extraordinary find comes exceptional danger. And William's newfound resilience will be tested in his struggle to protect his cache, which, by the way, pits him against some of the West's most notorious characters. Here is a clip from the beginning of the book.
William Jason Tertullius Johnson, the elder son of Philadelphia shipbuilder Silas Johnson, entered Yale College in the fall of 1875. According to his headmaster at Exeter, Johnson was gifted, attractive, athletic, and able. But the headmaster added that Johnson was headstrong, indolent, and badly spoilt, with a notable indifference to any motive save his own pleasures. Unless he finds a purpose to his life, he risks unseemly decline into indolence and vice. Those words could have served as the description of 1,000 young men in late 19th century America. Young men with intimidating, dynamic fathers, large quantities of money, and no particular way to pass the time. William Johnson fulfilled his headmaster's prediction during his first year at Yale. He was placed on probation in November for gambling, and again in February after an incident involving heavy drinking and the smashing of a New Haven merchant's window. Silas Johnson paid the bill. Despite such reckless behavior, Johnson remained courtly and even shy with women of his own age, for he had yet to have any luck with them. For their part, they found reason to seek his attention, their formal upbringings notwithstanding. In all other respects, however, he remained unrepentant. Early that spring, on a sunny afternoon, Johnson wrecked his roommate's yacht, running it aground on Long Island Sound. The boat sank within minutes. Johnson was rescued by a passing trawler. Asked what happened, he admitted to the incredulous fisherman that he did not know how to sail, because it would be so utterly tedious to learn. And anyway, it looks simple enough. Confronted by his roommate, Johnson admitted he had not asked permission to use the yacht because it was such a bother to find you. Faced with the bill for the lost yacht, Johnson's father complained to his friends that the cost of educating a young gentleman at Yale these days is ruinously expensive. His father was the serious son of a Scottish immigrant and took some pains to conceal the excesses of his offspring. In his letters, he repeatedly urged William to find a purpose in life. But William seemed content with his spoiled frivolity, and when he announced his intention to spend the coming summer in Europe, "The prospect," said his father, "fills me with direst fiscal dread." Thus his family was surprised when William Johnson abruptly decided to go west during the summer of 1876. Johnson never publicly explained why he had changed his mind, but those close to him at Yale knew the reason. He had decided to go west because of a bet. In his own words, from the journal he scrupulously kept. Every young man probably has an arch rival at some point in his life, and in my first year at Yale I had mine. Harold Hannibal Marlin was my own age, 18. He was handsome, athletic, well-spoken, soaking rich, and he was from New York, which he considered superior to Philadelphia in every respect. I found him insufferable. The sentiment was returned in kind. Marlin and I competed in every arena, in the classroom, on the playing field, in the undergraduate pranks of the night. Nothing would exist but that we would compete over it. We argued incessantly, always taking the opposing view from the other. One night at dinner, he said that the future of America lay in the developing West. I said it didn't, that the future of our great nation could hardly rest on a vast desert populated by savage aboriginal tribes. He replied I didn't know what I was talking about, because I hadn't been there. This was a sore point. Marlin had actually been to the West, at least as far as Kansas City, where his brother lived, and he never failed to express his superiority in this matter of travel. I had never succeeded in neutralizing it. Going west is no shakes. Any fool can go, I said. But all fools haven't gone. At least you haven't.
This is an exciting story with elements of science, the Old West, and many unlocked secrets to enjoy. In William Johnson, you will find an inspiring hero that only Michael Crichton could have imagined. This story is perfectly paced and brilliantly plotted, a winning adventure that is destined to become another Crichton classic. Now, if that appeals to you, head to audibletrial.com/Ron's Amazing Stories, and you can have Dragon Teeth for free. Here is what Audible has set up for us. They are offering a free audiobook and 30 days to give you the opportunity to check out their service. This also grants you access to the included catalog, which is being constantly updated with new titles. So to download your free audiobook today, go to audibletrial.com/Ron's Amazing Stories. Thank you, Audible. And now it's time for some of your stories.
These are your stories, sent by you, for you.
Our first story this time comes from Gladys Demure of Stanton, California. She is a longtime listener of the podcast and sent in this short tale called The Interrupted Funeral. My father passed away on June 18th, 2017, and he was a joker at heart. He passed away peacefully and of natural causes. However, his funeral was another matter. He asked for a closed casket and cremation. We as a family decided to have the casket at his memorial service and placed a 12x18 photo of him on top. The service was amazing. So many people got up and spoke about my father, telling stories ranging from his jokes to his community service. When it came time for his brother to speak, he stepped up to the podium and laid out his prepared notes. A strange breeze came up from nowhere and blew them all around the room. My uncle dashed after them to retrieve them, and as he did, the photo of my father fell off the casket and crashed to the ground. Mayhem ensued. Finally, after the glass was cleaned up and the notes were retrieved, my uncle returned to the pulpit. He simply said, "I don't think I'm going to read these. My brother has said everything that needs to be said." Gladys Demure, Stanton, California. Very cool, Gladys, and thank you for your story. I can honestly say that we've never had one quite like it. Do you believe in angels? Belanca Gardner from Addington, South London certainly does. Here is Belanca's story she calls Luke's Nurse. In 1998, my son was diagnosed with bone cancer at the tender age of 8. As sometimes happened, he came down with an infection, which meant he had to go to the hospital. He was there for about 2 weeks, and that's when something remarkable happened. One evening, I was sitting at his bedside quietly praying as he slept. A nurse came into the room to check his temperature, but I thought something odd about her. She was wearing an old-fashioned uniform of the type that would have been common in the 1940s. The nurse looked at me and noticed that I had a Bible. She said that she was a Christian and would like to pray for Luke's healing. I had never seen this odd nurse before and never saw her again at the hospital. My son was fully healed of the infection and is now completely free of cancer. I believe that nurse was my son's guardian angel coming down to give us some hope. If there wasn't something off, why would she have been wearing a 1940s nurse uniform? Balanka Gardner from Addington, South London. I gotta say, I love angel stories. They're always so very simple and don't require a shred of proof. These things just happen and can be just as easily explained as not. Could have been an eccentric nurse or an angel. It doesn't really matter, and the results are the proof. Thank you for your story, Balanka. I personally think it was an angelic visit. Our last story comes from Dennis Hammond from Roswell, New Mexico. Nope, I don't make this stuff up. Dennis says he's lived in Roswell his entire life and has come to the conclusion that everyone thinks that anyone that comes from here is a liar or crazy. He adds, "I really don't care because it's a strange place in more ways than one." He calls his story At Odds with the Desert. In the summer of 1974, I was sitting in my broken truck in the middle of the Chihuahuan Desert. I was in northern Mexico at the time and about 10 miles from the border. Not a place you want to be these days, but in the 70s, things were different. I was looking for artifacts and other things that I might sell in my shop to the thousands of alien tourists that come to Roswell each year. This trip had been a good one, and I was on my way back to New Mexico when the radiator blew. I didn't have enough water to survive and refill the radiator, so I repaired my truck and sat down to wait. After a few hours, I saw a set of lights heading towards me. It was getting along toward evening, and I thought I would finally get some help. As the lights came closer, they suddenly split into two and went straight up into the sky in two different directions. The rate of speed was unbelievable. They reformed high in the sky and then disappeared. A few minutes later, a second set of lights came towards me. This, however, at a slow rate and following the roadway. It was a car, and they had plenty of water to share. I returned home safely with, hopefully, an amazing story to tell. Dennis Hammond, Roswell, New Mexico. Well, Dennis, I would say that amazing covers it. We've had so many stories from New Mexico now that I am of the full belief that this place truly is the land of enchantment. Our featured story is actually 3 stories that are completely unrelated and come from various sources. But they do have some things in common. They are all short sci-fi, and they all come from the 1950s pulp magazine scene, also known as the golden age of science fiction. One more thing. They're all read by Rosalind Carlisle, who is a friend to the podcast and has read for us before. The first story that I'm going to play comes from the magazine If, Worlds of Science Fiction, the May 1953 edition. 20 years is a long time to live in anticipation. At least Professor Pettibone thought so, until the 20 years were up. The story is titled Say Hello For Me and was written by Frank W. Coggins.
This was to be the day. But of course, Professor Pettibourne had no way of knowing it. He arose, as he'd been doing for the previous 20 years, donned the tattered remnants of his spacesuit, and went out into the open. He stood erect, bronzed, magnificent, faced distant Earth, and recited, "Good morning, bright sunshine. We're glad you're here. You make the world happy, and bring us good cheer." It was something he'd heard as a child, and, isolated here on Mars, he had remembered it and used it to keep from losing his power of speech. The ritual finished, he walked to the edge of the nearest canal and gathered a bushel or so of dried Martian moss. He returned and began polishing the shiny exterior of the wrecked spaceship. It had to really glitter if it was to be an effective beacon in guiding the rescue ship. Professor Pettibourne had known for years, that a ship would come. It was just a matter of time, and as the years slipped by, his faith diminished not a whit. With his task half completed, he glanced up at the sun and quickened the polishing. It was a long walk to the place the berry bushes grew, and if he arrived too late, the sun would have dried out the night's crop of fragile berries, and he would wait until the morrow for nourishment. But on this day he was fated to arrive at the bush area not at all, because an alien sound from above again drew the professor's eyes from his work, and he knew that the day had arrived. The ship was 3 times as large as any he had ever visualized, and its futuristic design told him, sharply, how far he had fallen behind in his dreaming. He smiled and said quite calmly, "I dare say I am about to be rescued." And he experienced a thrill as the great ship set down and 2 men emerged therefrom. A thrill tingled with a guilt sense, because emotional experiences were rare in an isolated life, and seemed somehow indecent. The 2 men held weapons. They advanced upon Professor Pettibone, looked up into his face, reflected a certain wary hostility. That the hostility was tinged with instinctive respect, even awe, made it no less potent. One of them asked, "Fella, man came in ship, sky boat, long time ago. Him dead? Where?" Appropriate gestures accompanied the words. Professor Pettibone smiled down at the little men and bowed. "You are, of course, referring to me? I came in the ship. I am Professor Pettibone. It was nice of you to hunt me up." The eyes of the 2 Terran spacemen met and locked in startled inquiry. One of them voiced the reaction of both when he said, "What the hell?" "You no doubt are curious as to the fate of the other members of the expedition. They were killed, all save Fletcher, who lasted a week." Professor Pettibone waved a hand. "There, in the graveyard." But their eyes remained on the only survivor of that ill-fated first expedition. It was hard to accept him as the man they sought, but, faced with undeniable similarity between what they expected and what they'd found, the 2 spacemen had no alternative. "I hope your food supply is ample and varied," Professor Pettibone said. This seemed to bring them out of their bemusement. "Of course, Professor. Would you care to come aboard?" The other made a try at congenial levity. "You must be pretty hungry after 20 years. "Really? Has it been that long? I tried to keep track at first." "We can blast off any time you say. You're probably pretty anxious to get back." "Indeed I am. The changes in 20 years must be breathtaking. I wonder if they'll remember me." A short time later, the professor said, "It's amazing, a ship of this size handled by only 2 men." Then he sat down to a repast laid out by one of the odd spacemen. But after nibbling a bit of this, a forkful of that, he found that satisfaction lay in the anticipation more so than in the eating. "We'll look around and see what we can find in the way of clothing for you, Professor," one of the spacemen said. Then the man's bemusement returned. His eyes travelled over the magnificent physique before him, the perfect giant of a man, the great Apollo-like head with the calm, clear eyes, the expression of complete contentment and serenity. The spaceman said, "Professor, to what do you attribute the changes in your body? What is there about this planet?" "I really don't know." Professor Pettibone looked down his torso with an impersonal eye. "I think the greenish skin pigmentation is a result of mineral-heavy vapors that occur during certain seasons. The growth. As to my body, I really don't know." But the two spacemen, though they didn't refer to it, were not concerned with the body so much as the aura of completeness, the radiation of contentment which came from somewhere within. And it was passing strange that nothing more was said about the professor returning to Earth. No great revelation suddenly arrived at that he would not go. Rather, they discussed various things that three gentlemen meeting casually would discuss. Then Professor Pettibone arose from his chair and said, "It was kind of you to drop off and see me." And one of the spacemen replied, "A pleasure, sir, a real pleasure indeed." Then the professor left the ship and watched it lift up on a tail of red fire and go away. He raised an arm and waved. "Say hello for me," he called. Then he turned away and, from force of habit, he began again to polish the hull, knowing that he would keep it shining and be proud of it for many, many years to come. Almost beyond reach of the planet, one of the spacemen flipped a switch and put certain sensitive communication mechanisms to work. So sensitive they could pick up etheric vibrations far away and make them audible. But only faintly came the pleasant voice of a contented man. "Good morning, bright sunshine. We're glad you're here. You make the world." End of Say Hello for Me by Frank W. Coggins.
So I guess it's appropriate to say at this point that it's best to adapt than to overcome. I'm sure that Professor Pettibone would agree. That story was written by Frank W. Coggins. I couldn't find any info on Frank unless, of course, he was a professional baseball player who played for the Milwaukee Brewers in the 1970s. And I really don't think he was. Our next story comes from Galaxy Magazine, February 1954 edition. It tells us that it might be best to leave well enough alone. The problem is that we hardly ever take our own advice. The story is titled Experiment and was written by Fredric Brown.
"The first time machine, gentlemen," Professor Johnson proudly informed his two colleagues. "True, it is a small-scale experimental model. It will operate only on objects weighing less than 3 pounds, 5 ounces, and for distances into the past and future of 12 minutes or less. But it works." The small-scale model looked like a small scale, a postage scale, except for 2 dials in the part under the platform. Professor Johnson held up a small metal cube. "Our experimental object," he said, "is a brass cube weighing 1 pound, 2.3 ounces. First, I shall send it 5 minutes into the future." He leaned forward and set one of the dials on the time machine. "Look at your watches," he said. They looked at their watches. Professor Johnson placed the cube gently on the machine's platform. It vanished. 5 minutes later, to the second, it reappeared. Professor Johnson picked it up. "Now, 5 minutes into the past." He set the other dial. Holding the cube in his hand, he looked at his watch. "It is 6 minutes before 3 o'clock. I shall now activate the mechanism by placing the cube on the platform at exactly 3 o'clock. Therefore, the cube should at 5 minutes before 3 vanish from my hand and appear on the platform 5 minutes before I place it there." "How can you place it there, then?" asked one of his colleagues. "It will, as my hand approaches, vanish from the platform and appear in my hand to be placed there. 3 o'clock. Notice, please." The cube vanished from his hand. It appeared on the platform of the time machine. "See? 5 minutes before I place it there, it is there." His other colleague frowned at the cube. "But," he said, "what if now that it has already appeared 5 minutes before you place it there, you should change your mind about doing so and not place it there at 3 o'clock? Wouldn't there be a paradox of some sort involved?" "An interesting idea," Professor Johnson said. "I had not thought of it, and it will be interesting to try. Very well, I shall not—" There was no paradox at all. The cube remained, but the entire rest of the universe, professors and all, vanished. End of experiment by Fredric Brown.
It's my guess that if we ever do figure out time travel, something like this is pretty inevitable. But hey, that's just my opinion. That story was written by the prolific author Fredric Brown. He was a science fiction, fantasy, and mystery writer. One of his stories, Arena, was adapted to an episode of the original Star Trek. How about that? Our last story in the series of 3 comes from Fantastic Universe magazine, the August 1957 edition. He didn't know how he could stand there for 4 months alone. So he found some company, and one could almost talk to her. The story is titled No Pets Allowed, and was written by M.A. Cummings.
"I can't tell anyone about it. In the first place, they'd never believe me. And if they did, I'd probably be punished for having her, because we aren't allowed to have pets of any kind. It wouldn't have happened if they hadn't sent me way out there to work. But, you see, there are so many things I can't do. I remember the day the chief of vacation took me before the council. 'I've tried him on a dozen things,' he reported. 'People always talk about me as if I can't understand what they mean, but I'm really not that dumb. There doesn't seem to be a thing he can do,' the chief went on. 'Actually, his intelligence seems to be no greater than that which we believe our ancestors had back in the 20th century. As bad as that?' observed one of the council members. 'You do have a problem.' 'But we must find something for him to do,' said another. 'We cannot have an idle person in the state. It's unthinkable.' 'But what?' asked the chief. 'He's utterly incapable of running any of the machines. I've tried to teach him. The only things he can do are already being done much better by robots.' There was a long silence, broken at last by one little old council member. 'I have it!' he cried. 'The very thing. We'll make him guard of the treasure.' 'But there's no need of a guard. No one will touch the treasure without permission. We haven't had a dishonest person in the state for more than 3,000 years. 'That's it exactly. There aren't any dishonest people, so there won't be anything for him to do. But we will have solved the problem of his idleness.' 'It might be a solution,' said the chief. 'At least a temporary one. I suppose we will have to find something else later on. But this will give us time to look for something.' So I became guard of the treasure, with a badge, and nothing to do, unless you count watching the key. The gates were kept locked, just as they were in the old days, but the large key hung beside them. Of course, no one wanted to bother carrying it around. It was too heavy. The only ones who ever used it anyway were members of the council. As the man said, we haven't had a dishonest person in the state for thousands of years. Even I know that much. Of course, this left me with lots of time on my hands. That's how I happened to get her in the first place. I'd always wanted one, but pets were forbidden. Busy people didn't have time for them. So I knew I was breaking the law. but I figured that no one would ever find out. First, I fixed a place for her and made a brush screen so that she couldn't be seen by anyone coming to the gates. Then, one night, I sneaked into the forest and got her. It wasn't so lonely after that. Now I had something to talk to. She was small when I got her. It would be too dangerous to go near a full-grown one. But she grew rapidly. That was because I caught small animals and brought them to her. Not having to depend on what she could catch, she grew almost twice as fast as usual, and was so sleek and pretty. Really, she was a pet to be proud of. I don't know how I could have stood the 4 months there alone if I hadn't had her to talk to. I don't think she really understood me, but I pretended she did, and that helped. Every 3 or 4 weeks, 3 of the council members came to take a part of the treasure, or to add to it. Always 3 of them. That's why I was so surprised one day to see one man coming by himself. It was Graham, the little old member, who had recommended that I be given this job. I was happy to see him, and we talked for a while, mostly about my work and how I liked it. I almost told him about my pet, but I didn't, because he might be angry at me for breaking the law. Finally, he asked me to give him the key. "I've been sent to get something from the treasure," he explained. I was unhappy to displease him, but I said, "I can't let you have it. There must be 3 members. You know that." "Of course I know it, but something came up suddenly, so they sent me alone. Now let me have it." I shook my head. That was the one order they had given me, never to give the key to any one person who came alone. Graham became quite angry. "You idiot!" he shouted. "Why do you think I had you put out here? It was so I could get in there and help myself to the treasure." "But that would be dishonest, and there are no dishonest people in the state." "For 3,000 years, I know." His usually kind face had an ugly look I had never seen before. "But I'm going to get part of that treasure, and it won't do you any good to report it, 'cause no one's going to take the word of a fool like you against a respected council member. They'll think you are the dishonest one. Now give me that key." It's a terrible thing to disobey a council member, but if I obeyed him, I would be disobeying all the others. That would be worse. "No," I shouted. He threw himself upon me. For his size and age, he was very strong, stronger even than I. I fought as hard as I could, but I knew I would not be able to keep him away from the key for very long, and if he took the treasure, I would be blamed. The council would have to think a new punishment for dishonesty. Whatever it was, it would be terrible indeed. He drew back and rushed at me. Just as he hit me, my foot caught upon a root and I fell. His rush carried him past me, and he crashed through the brush screen beside the path. I heard him scream twice. Then there was silence. I was bruised all over, but I managed to pull myself up and take away what was left of the screen. There was no sign of Graham, but my beautiful pet was waving her pearl green feelers as she always did in thanks for a good meal. That's why I can't tell anyone what happened. No one would believe that Graham would be dishonest, and I can't prove it because she ate the proof. Even if I did tell them, no one is going to believe that a flycatcher plant, even a big one like mine, would actually be able to eat a man. So they think that Graham disappeared, and I'm still out here with her. She's grown so much larger now and more beautiful than ever. But I hope she hasn't developed a taste for human flesh. Lately, when she stretches out her feelers, it seems that she's trying to reach me. End of No Pets Allowed by M.A. Cummings.
You know, I've heard people say that pets are a bother. In this case, I think that a pet may have just saved the world, or at least our hero's job. That story was written by Monette A. Cummings, 1914 through 1999. She was a writer of pulp fiction of various genres, including Regency romance and, of course, science fiction. All of our stories today were read by Rosalind Carlyle. We've had her stories many times on the podcast before, and she is a regular performer at LibriVox.org. I will have a link to her catalog at LibriVox where you can listen to more of her stories if you have a mind to. And let me tell you, there are a lot of them.
Johnny, is this true?
As you know by now, I like to surf the internet to find the strange and unusual. I do this in the name of the podcast, but the truth is, I would do it anyway, even if there was no podcast. What you're about to hear is...
Johnny, is this true?
I will tell you a story and then ask the question, did I make it up or is it true? Your job is to decide. Let's get started.
Johnny, is this true?
This time on Johnny, Is It True? I'm going to give you an invention and tell you what science fiction platform inspired it. All you have to do is decide if I made it up or if it's a real thing. Let's get started with an easy one. Fact number 1. The original Star Trek had a famous gadget called the communicator, which looks similar to the early cell phones. Some say that it inspired the modern cell phone. Can that be true? It is true. Martin Cooper, who oversaw the invention of the first mobile phone in the 1970s, directly credited Star Trek for inspiring his vision. Another Star Trek invention to cross into reality is the PADD, a device first seen in Star Trek The Next Generation in the late 80s. The Personal Access Display device bears a very strong resemblance to today's iPads. It even utilizes a smooth, flat touchscreen interface. How about that? Fact number 2. Sticking with the cell phone. Do you use earbuds? Would it interest you to know that Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451 predicted these in his book? No, really, he did. In 1953, when Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451 was published, portable headphones did exist, but they were massive and ugly and weighed a ton. Bradbury's description of the little seashells thimble radios exactly describes earbud headphones, which didn't come into wide use until the year 2000. Ray was one amazing writer. Fact number 3. Jules Verne predicted many things in his books. Everyone knows about the submarine, but how about the radio? Did he get that one right, too? He did. In his 1889 article, The Year 2889, Jules Verne predicted an alternative to newspapers. Instead of being printed, the news of the day was spoken to subscribers. It might be interesting to note that the first newscast took place exactly 30 years later, and the first television newscast occurred 28 years after that. By 1974, millions of people could watch important events on their televisions. All hail to Jules Verne. Fact number 4. Okay, Jules Verne's 1865 novel From Earth to the Moon speculated about a light-propelled spacecraft. Would you believe that NASA uses that very same technology today? Now wait a minute. We don't have spaceships flying to the moon. That has to be fake, right? Wrong. That technology exists today in solar sails, which is a form of spacecraft propulsion used by NASA. NASA's Advanced Composite Solar Sail System, or ACS-3, is a solar-sailed spacecraft launching into Earth's orbit in 2023. Solar sails harness the gentle push of sunlight for spacecraft propulsion. Now that is truly amazing. Well, that is our bit of science fiction factory that should blow your mind just a bit. To think that our science fiction writers of the past truly were visionaries of the present, that's kind of cool. It's time now for old-time radio commercials brought to you by Claddy's Goodies. Good treats for your dog to eat. Now, I'm pretty sure that you'll remember this first one. Well, at least I remember this one.
My dog's faster than yours, dog. My dog's bigger than yours. My dog's better 'cause he gets kennel ration. My dog's better than yours.
Kennel ration. The lean red meat he wants, the other good things he needs. Juicy, tender, and moist.
My dog's prettier, smarter, taller. My dog's better than yours.
Kennel ration.
I've got a question for you. When do you think Velveeta was invented? If you said in the 50s, you'd be wrong. Velveeta cheese first hit the market in 1918. It was created by Emil Fry of the Monroe Cheese Company in Monroe, New York. The product was advertised as a nutritious health food. How about that?
Now, in November, come the longer evenings when folks drop in to play bridge or stop for a snack after the movies. So keep the refrigerator stocked with Kraft's famous cheese food, Velveeta, to spread or slice for swell toasted sandwiches. Velveeta is a natural for late evening snacks, you know, because it's digestible as milk itself. These days, you really ought to be buying rich golden Velveeta in the 2-pound size, so you'll have plenty for snacks and also to melt for economical meatless main dishes. Remember, smooth melting Velveeta helps supply the protein you expect from a main dish, but the price is low. Tomorrow, get Kraft's famous Velveeta.
Okay, this next one is very near and dear to my heart. I have always loved my Good and Plenties. The candy was first produced by the Quaker City Confectionery Company in Philadelphia in 1893. And it is the oldest branded candy in the United States. Choo Choo Charlie, the engineer who filled his train with Good and Plenty, first appeared in advertisements in 1950.
Once upon a time there was an engineer. Choo-choo Charlie was his name, we hear. He had an engine and he sure had fun. He used Good and Plenty candy to make his train run.
Charlie says, love my Good and Plenty. Charlie says, really rings the bell. Charlie says, love my Good and Plenty. Don't know any other candy that I love so well.
Our last one comes from Budweiser. This one features the Crew Cuts. They were a Canadian vocal quartet that made a number of popular records that charted in the United States and worldwide. They named themselves after the then popular Crew Cut haircut.
Budweiser commercial featuring the Crew Cut.
Where there's life, there's fun. At a concert or a show, in your own backyard, wherever you go. Budweiser beer is for folks to know where there's life. There's Budweiser.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that little trip into the past. Who doesn't love an old-time radio commercial? The date is August 25th, 1944, and this is A Moment in Time. What you're about to hear is what really happened as captured by the microphones that were there that day. The liberation of Paris was a military battle that took place during World War II from August 19th, 1944, until the German garrison surrendered the French capital some 6 days later. What you're about to hear was reported by Richard Wessel of the BBC.
Here is the news, read by Richard Wessel. Paris has been liberated. A communique just received from General Koenig announces that it has been liberated by French forces of the interior.
Marvelous sights I've ever seen coming down the boulevard into the heart of Paris. Everywhere we went, people came running out of their houses, out of the shops, shaking hands with us. Children were held up to us to be kissed, and they clung around our necks. People were giving us flowers, tomatoes, everything. It's been the most marvelous procession I've ever seen. Here they are, they're just mad with joy. Just listen to these crowds. The generals now turn to face the square, and this huge crowd of Parisians is being presented to people. It's being received. It's being received. Even while the general is marching, into the cathedral.
Mayhem broke loose and sniper shots were fired at General Charles de Gaulle. This next recording was 24 hours and by the same reporter.
Well, that was one of the most dramatic scenes I've ever seen. Just as General de Gaulle was about to enter the Cathedral of Notre Dame, firing started all over the place. I'm afraid we couldn't get you the noise of that firing because I was overwhelmed by a rush of people who were trying to seek shelter, and my cable parted from my microphone. But I fell just near General de Gaulle, and I managed to pick myself up. General de Gaulle was trying to control the crowds rushing into the cathedral. He walked straight ahead into what appeared to me to be a hail of fire from somewhere inside the cathedral, somewhere from the galleries up near the vaulted roof. But he went straight ahead without hesitation, his shoulders flung back, and walked right down the central aisle, even while the bullets were pouring around him.
And there you have another moment in time. That was episode number 578, and I want to thank Gladius Dumore, Blanca Gardner, Dennis Hammond, and Rosalind Carlisle for helping us out today. You guys are the best. If you want to follow the podcast or the blog, head to ronsamazingstories.com. There you will find any of the links I mentioned and how to contact us. Do you want to help the show? The best thing you can do is to tell your friends all about it, and please leave reviews or feedback wherever you listen. Clicking that follow or like button helps us grow. Thank you for listening, and I hope you come again to find out what are Ron's Amazing Stories.